You ever wonder what a man's life is worth? Is it the gold in his pocket, the reputation he builds, or is it something else entirely? For Thomas McKenna, standing on a makeshift gallows with a rope scratching his neck, the answer was staring him right in the face. It was in the jeering crowd of miners down below. It was in the cold December wind whipping through Deadwood. In 3 minutes, Thomas was scheduled to die, hanged for a crime he didn't commit. But as he scanned the sea of angry faces, he was only looking for one person, one pair of dark, unreadable eyes. The eyes of the woman who'd started all this, the woman who'd saved his life, and in doing so, had damned them both. He knew, even with the rope burning his skin, he'd make the same choice all over again. Because 6 months earlier, Thomas McKenna wasn't a hero. He wasn't a husband. He was just a ghost. See, at 40 years old, Thomas had never known a woman. Not in the biblical sense, anyway. He'd spent 20 years of his life on the run, not from the law, but from himself, from a past so dark it could swallow a man whole. He drifted from town to town, a bounty hunter by trade, but a loner by necessity. He was good with a gun, better at disappearing. He collected bounties on men who thought they could outrun their sins, all while running from his own. He rode into Deadwood territory with nothing but a worn Colt, 45 and a silence that made folks nervous. This place was a festering sore on the frontier, a mining town where gold fever had cooked the decency right out of people, leaving behind nothing but greed and desperation. His boots clicked on the floorboards of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a place that reeked of stale whiskey and unwashed ambition. And that's where he saw her. Behind the bar, a young native woman moved with a quiet grace that didn't belong in a place like this. Her hair was braided long and black down her back, and her simple dress had seen better days. But she held herself like a queen in a court of thieves. The miners called her Raven, a cruel name for a woman they'd caged. Thomas would later learn her real name was Ayanna. It meant eternal blossom in her people's tongue. She'd been working there for 2 months, trapped. Her father had died chasing gold, leaving her with a mountain of debt to the saloon's owner, a rat-faced weasel named Silas Corbin. Corbin was the kind of man who smiled while he put a knife in your back. He charged Ayanna for room, for board, for the privilege of having his drunken customers slobber all over her. It was a debt she could never repay, a cage she could never escape. Thomas ordered a whiskey and just watched. He saw the whole story in the way she moved. She never smiled. Her eyes were old, filled with a weariness that didn't belong in a girl her age. When a big, beefy miner with hands like ham hocks grabbed her wrist, she twisted away with a practiced move. The man just laughed, an ugly, guttural sound, and reached for her again. And that's when Thomas stood up. The miner was twice his size, but Thomas had a lifetime of experience in dealing with bullies. It wasn't a fight, it was a correction. One punch, clean and hard, sent the big man sprawling over a poker table, scattering cards and coins like autumn leaves. The whole saloon went dead silent. You could have heard a feather drop. And for the first time, Ayanna looked at him. Really looked at him. In her eyes, Thomas saw something he hadn't seen in 20 years. Something he thought was long dead and buried. Hope. It was faint, like a single candle flicker in a hurricane. But it was there. Then Silas Corbin slithered out from his back office. He was a small man with a greasy mustache that tried to make up for his lack of a spine. "You just cost me a customer, stranger," he whined. "That fella spends a lot of coin in here." Thomas took a slow sip of his whiskey, setting the glass down with a deliberate click. Maybe he should learn some manners. Corbin's eyes narrowed into little slits. "Maybe you should mind your own business. The girl works for me. She's my property." The word hung in the air. Property. Thomas had faced down killers, outlaws, and madmen. But the way Ayanna stood there, her knuckles white as she gripped a bar towel, her face a perfect still mask. That's what made his decision for him. He tossed a silver dollar on the bar, the sound echoing in the silence, and walked out into the dusty twilight. He didn't leave town, though. He couldn't. He had a feeling things in Deadwood were about to get a whole lot worse, and he was right. Thomas became a fixture in that saloon, a ghost in the corner, nursing a single whiskey for hours on end. He was a hunter, and he was learning his prey. Not the girl, Ayanna, but the whole rotten system that had its teeth in her. He learned that she wasn't just some poor, uneducated native. She spoke 3 languages. She could calculate odds faster than the card sharps she served. She'd been to a mission school, a place of books and learning, until her father's gold fever dragged her into this hell. When her father died of consumption, Corbin had been there, waiting like a vulture. He'd covered the burial costs. A kindness, he'd called it, but it was a hook. The debt started at $50. Now through Corbin's twisted math, it was over 300. Room and board, broken glasses, protection fees. Every month the number grew bigger and the cage grew smaller. Thomas had seen this game 100 times. A pretty girl, a mountain of fake debt. It never ended well. Corbin was just warming up. Soon he'd start demanding other services. The thought made Thomas's jaw clench so tight his teeth ached. This wasn't just injustice, it was evil, pure and simple. One night, with a storm brewing over the Black Hills, he finally spoke to her. The saloon was empty, save for a drunk snoring in the corner. Corbin was in his office, counting his dirty money. Ayanna was wiping down tables, her movements slow and tired. "How much does he say you owe now?" Thomas asked, his voice low. She looked up, startled. A flicker of fear, then suspicion. "Why do you care?" Her English was perfect, a strange mix of mission school properness and the musical rhythm of her native tongue. "Just wondering what a person's freedom costs these days." Her hand stopped moving. "I'm not for sale." "That's not what I meant," he said, taking off his hat. He felt clumsy, out of his depth. "I meant paying off that snake Corbin." 350, she said, her voice flat. "It grows every week, and even if someone paid it, where would I go? What would I do? This is all I have." She looked at him, and for a second, the mask slipped. He saw a young woman, terrified and alone, trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. And Thomas, the man who'd spent his life avoiding any and all attachments, felt something shift inside him, something he'd buried long ago. He left without another word. But that night, lying in his cheap boarding house bed, listening to the storm rage outside, he couldn't get her face out of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that his drifting days were over, that he'd finally found something worth stopping for. The next morning, news hit Deadwood like a lightning strike. A gang of outlaws led by a ruthless killer named Jake Torino had robbed the Territorial Bank in Miles City. They'd made off with $12,000 in gold, and the governor was offering a $2,000 bounty for their capture. Dead or alive, Thomas knew the name, Jake Torino, a vicious, cold-blooded snake he'd been tracking on and off for 3 years. And the rumors were all the same. Torino and his gang were headed straight for Deadwood. This was it, a sign from Providence itself. He could have gone to the sheriff, a decent but overwhelmed man named Bradley. But Thomas had a different plan, a better plan. He'd take down Torino himself, collect the $2,000 bounty. He'd march right into the silver dollar, slap that money on the bar, and buy Ayanna's freedom. The rest would be enough to get her a fresh start, somewhere far away from this pit. It was a perfect plan, solid, simple. But Thomas McKenna had one fatal flaw. He'd never been lucky in his life, and he had no idea that Jake Torino wasn't just another outlaw. He was the devil himself, and he was coming to collect his due. Torino rode into town on a Tuesday, not with a bang, but with a whisper. He had 4 men with him, each with a face like a tombstone. They didn't cause trouble. They just settled in. They took rooms above the Silver Dollar Saloon, which meant they spent their nights downstairs, drinking Corbin's whiskey and eyeing his prize. The way they looked at Ayanna made Thomas's skin crawl. It wasn't just lust, it was ownership, like they were inspecting a horse they were about to buy. Thomas watched from his corner, his hand never straying far from the Colt tucked in his belt. He could feel the tension in the room coiling tighter and tighter, like a spring wound to the breaking point. Everyone could feel it. The whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion. It came on a Thursday night. One of Torino's men, a scarred brute named Dutch Henley, decided he was done waiting. He cornered Ayanna by the stairs. his intentions as clear as the whiskey on his breath. He pressed her against the wall, one meaty hand tangling in her dress. Thomas was moving before he even thought about it. His chair scraped back. The world seemed to slow down. The Colt was in his hand, cold and heavy and familiar. He pressed the barrel right against Dutch's temple. Let go of her. The saloon went so quiet you could hear the sweat dripping from the ceiling. Every eye was on them, the hunter, the outlaw, and the girl. Dutch slowly, very slowly, raised his hands. "You just made a big mistake, friend," he snarled. "Probably," Thomas said, his voice calm as a frozen lake. "But it's my mistake to make." Then a new voice cut through the silence, smooth as poison. "Well now, looks like we got ourselves a white knight." It was Jake Torino. He was sitting at a table in the back, smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was the smile of a wolf looking at a lamb. "Tell me, hero," Torino said, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. "Are you willing to die for some Indian girl who ain't even grateful?" Thomas kept his gun on Dutch, but his eyes were locked on Torino. "Why don't you ask her yourself?" Every head in the room turned to Iona. She was pressed against the wall, her dress torn, her face pale. For a long second she just stood there, trembling. Thomas thought she was going to break, thought she'd stay silent, let him take the fall. But then she lifted her chin, and in a voice that was clear and strong and rang through that whole damn saloon, she said, "I would rather die free than live as your property." Torino's smile vanished. His laugh was sharp and ugly. "Well, ain't that touching? Dutch, I think our friend here needs to learn some manners." It happened in a heartbeat. Dutch went for his gun. He was fast, but Thomas was faster. The roar of the Colt filled the room. Dutch spun around, a look of shock on his face, and crashed into a table. The saloon erupted into chaos. Gunfire and screams and splintering wood. Thomas dove behind the bar, pulling Ayana down with him. Bullets chewed up the wood above their heads. When the smoke cleared, less than 30 seconds later, the world had changed. Dutch was dead. Another of Torino's men was on the floor, clutching his gut. And Silas Corbin, the saloon owner, was laying in the doorway of his office with a shotgun blast in his chest, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. But Jake Torino, he was gone, vanished into the night like a bad dream. Thomas had won the fight, but he was about to find out he'd just lost the war. Because as Sheriff Bradley and his deputies burst through the doors, guns drawn, they weren't looking at the dead outlaws. They were looking straight at him. "Thomas McKenna," the sheriff said, his face grim, "you're under arrest for murder." Murder. The word didn't make sense. "It was self-defense, Sheriff," Thomas said, pressing a rag to the fresh bullet wound in his own shoulder. "Everyone here saw Dutch draw first." Sheriff Bradley sighed, a weary sound. "Maybe so, but it seems Jake Torino had a little chat with Judge Morrison this afternoon. Told him all about a bounty hunter named McKenna who'd been stalking his crew, planning to murder him for the reward money. Filed a whole official complaint. Harassment. Threats. The works." The trap snapped shut. It was brilliant. Twisted, but brilliant. Torino hadn't just walked into town. He'd prepared the battlefield. He'd bought himself an alibi with the law before a single shot was fired. Judge Morrison was a hard man, known for his hatred of bounty hunters and his iron-fisted interpretation of the law. To him, men like Thomas were no better than the criminals they chased. Thomas was no longer a hero. He was a cold-blooded killer. He spent the next 3 days in a dusty jail cell, the world shrinking down to 4 stone walls. The town that had watched him defend a helpless woman now whispered his name like a curse. Ayana was the only one who visited. She brought him food and clean bandages. She sat on the other side of the bars, her dark eyes filled with a guilt that cut him deeper than any bullet. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "I did." "Why?" It was the question he'd been asking himself. For 20 years, he'd lived by one rule. Look out for number one. Helping others was a luxury, a quick way to get yourself killed. But sitting in that cell, looking at this woman who had somehow gotten under his skin, he finally had an answer. Because someone should. The trial was a joke. A kangaroo court held in a converted saloon that still smelled of stale beer. Judge Morrison sat up there like God on his throne, his eyes already filled with judgment. Witness after witness confirmed the facts. Dutch Henley had assaulted Ayanna. Thomas had defended her. Dutch had drawn first. But then Jake Torino took the stand, and he wept. He spun a tale of a simple prospector, Dutch, having a drink with friends. He painted Thomas as a predator, a bloodthirsty bounty hunter who'd started a fight over a saloon girl. He claimed Thomas had threatened them, stalked them, planned to shoot them down in the street for money. It was all lies, but he told them with the fire and brimstone of a preacher. He produced fake mining claims for Dutch. He read letters from a fictional family back east. He even had another of his gang members pose as a traveling merchant who swore he'd seen Thomas threaten Dutch just days before. And then came the twist that sealed Thomas's fate. The prosecution called a surprise witness, a man who swore he'd seen the whole thing from the back of the saloon, a man who claimed Thomas had fired the first shot, unprovoked. It was Deputy Collins, the sheriff's right-hand man, the man who'd brought Thomas his meals in jail, who'd seemed to sympathize with him. Torino had gotten to him. A bag of gold, a threat against his family, who knew? It didn't matter. The betrayal was absolute. The guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion. When Judge Morrison sentenced him to hang, Thomas felt a strange calm wash over him. His eyes found Ayanna in the back of the courtroom. Her face was a mask of horror. She had believed in justice. She had believed the truth would save him. She was about to learn the hard way that in a town like Deadwood, the truth was just another commodity to be bought and sold. That night, she came to his cell one last time. "This is my fault," she whispered, her hands gripping the bars. "If I hadn't been there, none of this would have happened." He reached through the bars, his fingers brushing against hers. "If you hadn't been there," he said, his voice softer than he thought possible, "I would have died a long time ago without ever knowing what I was fighting for." A flicker of understanding in her eyes. In that dusty jail cell, with death hanging over them, they both knew. They had fallen in love. A quiet, desperate love born in violence and fear. "I can't let you die for me," she said, her voice choked with tears. "You're not letting me do anything. This is my choice." She looked at him, her eyes suddenly hard as flint. "Then let me make mine." Before he could ask what she meant, she was gone. Thomas spent the night pacing his cell, a cold dread clawing at his gut. He knew she was going to do something desperate, something foolish. He was right. The next morning, the whole town was buzzing. Jake Torino had gone before Judge Morrison. He'd recanted his entire testimony. He'd been troubled by his conscience, he claimed. He couldn't let an innocent man hang. The truth, he now said, was that Dutch Henley was the aggressor. Thomas McKenna was a hero who had acted in self-defense. Judge Morrison was furious, but he couldn't hang a man when his star witness suddenly changed his tune. The charges were dismissed. Thomas McKenna walked out of the courtroom a free man. But the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew what it had cost. He didn't need anyone to tell him. Ayanna had gone to Torino. She had traded the one thing she had left to save his life, her body, her soul. He found her in a small room at the boarding house. She was sitting on the bed, staring out the window. She didn't turn when he came in. "What did you do?" he asked, though he already knew. Her voice was a ghost. "What do you think I did?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to rage. He wanted to scream. He wanted to ride out and put a bullet between Jake Torino's eyes. But he just stood there broken. "You shouldn't have," was all he could manage. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes empty. "Someone I loved was going to die. I did what was necessary." She took a deep breath. "It was just one night. It doesn't have to change anything." But they both knew it did. It changed everything. A shadow now lay between them, a ghost that would haunt them forever. What could he possibly do now? How could they ever move past this? He looked at her, this woman who had sacrificed her own honor for his life, and he felt a surge of something so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It wasn't pity. It was a fierce, protective love. He walked over to the bed and sat down beside her, careful not to touch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Everything he had in the world, a little over $200. "This is for you," he said, placing it on the bed between them. It's enough to get you somewhere new, somewhere safe. She stared at the pouch. I told you, I'm not for sale. I'm not buying you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm setting you free. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw tears well up in her eyes. And what about you? She whispered. What about your freedom? He knew what he had to do. It was the only way. My freedom, he said, is you. He took her hand. It was cold and trembling. Marry me, Ayana. Let me spend the rest of my life making this right. Let me protect you. Let's build something together. Something they can't ever touch. She stared at him, shock and disbelief warring in her eyes. They'll never leave us alone, she said. Torino owns this town. Then we'll leave, he said. We'll disappear. We'll find a piece of land so far out in the wilderness, God himself will need a map to find us. And that's when Ayana told him something that changed everything. Again. You don't understand, she whispered, leaning closer, her eyes darting toward the door. What happened in that room? It wasn't what you think. I didn't just give in. Thomas stared at her, confused. He was drunk, she said, her voice barely audible. He was bragging. He told me things, Thomas. Things about the bank robbery, names, dates, where he stashed some of the gold. He even told me about a ledger he keeps, a little black book with every crime he's ever committed, every official he's ever paid off, including Judge Morrison and Deputy Collins. Thomas's mind reeled. She hadn't just sacrificed her body. She had used it as a weapon. She had gone into the lion's den, not as a lamb, but as a spy. He thinks I was just a scared little girl he could use and throw away, she said, a flicker of fire returning to her eyes. He has no idea what I took from him. The game had changed. This wasn't about running anymore. This was about justice. But how could they get that ledger? How could two people stand against a man who owned the entire town? It seemed impossible. A suicide mission. But looking at Ayana, at the strength and courage shining in her eyes, Thomas knew one thing for sure. He'd follow her straight into the fires of hell if she asked him to. And it looked like that's exactly where they were headed. They were married 3 days later by a traveling preacher who was too drunk to ask questions. Sheriff Bradley stood as their witness, his face a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. He knew something was wrong in his town, but he didn't have the power to fix it. He saw in Thomas and Ayana a desperation he recognized, the desperation of good people trapped in a bad place. Their wedding night wasn't spent in a soft bed. It was spent in a dark corner of the livery stable, huddled over a lantern, planning. Ayana had a memory like a steel trap. She recounted every detail Torino had let slip. The ledger he'd boasted was kept in a safe in Silas Corbin's old office at the Silver Dollar, which Torino had now claimed as his own. He'd also mentioned a hideout, a line shack in the hills where he met his contacts and kept his stolen gold. The plan they hatched was insane. It had 1,000 ways to go wrong and only one way to go right. Thomas would use the money he had to buy a small, remote homestead claim a few miles out of town. They would make a show of settling down, of giving up. They needed Torino to believe they were broken, defeated, that he had won. They needed him to get comfortable. For the next few months, that's exactly what they did. They worked from sunup to sundown, building a small cabin, clearing a patch of land. They were the very picture of new beginnings. Thomas hung up his gun belt. Ayana planted a garden. To anyone watching, they were just another pair of settlers trying to carve a life out of the wilderness. But at night, their real work began. Thomas would slip away from the cabin, melting into the shadows. He used his tracking skills not to hunt men, but to hunt information. He watched the Silver Dollar. He followed Torino's men. He mapped out their routines, their patrols. He was a ghost, gathering whispers and rumors, piecing together the shape of Torino's operation. Ayana, meanwhile, was fighting a different kind of war. She used her knowledge of herbs and plants, taught by her people, to make friends with the other homestead wives. She'd bring them remedies for colic, salves for burns. And as they sat around kitchen tables, they would talk. They'd speak of husbands who'd lost their mining claims to men with official-looking papers. They'd whisper about sons who'd been beaten for looking at Torino's men the wrong way. Ayana collected their stories, their pain, their anger. She was gathering an army, not of soldiers, but of silent witnesses. They were two halves of a single blade, sharpening themselves in the dark. But Torino was no fool. He was a snake, and snakes are always coiled, ready to strike. He'd send his men to ride by their homestead at odd hours, a silent threat. Once, they found a dead raven nailed to their cabin door. A message: "I haven't forgotten you. I still own you." Then, Ayanna told Thomas she was pregnant. The news was a ray of sunshine in a world of shadows. It was hope, tangible and real, a future. But it was also a weakness, a vulnerability they couldn't afford. It changed the timeline. They had to act, and they had to act now, before the baby came, before Torino decided to collect on his old debts. The plan was set for the night of the new moon, the darkest night of the month. The town was holding a Founders' Day celebration. There would be drinking, music, fireworks, the perfect cover for what they had to do. The plan had two parts. Part one was for Thomas. He was going to hit Torino's line shack in the hills. Ayanna remembered Torino boasting that he was meeting a territorial official that night to deliver a bribe. Thomas wasn't after the gold. He was after the official. He needed a witness, a powerful one. Part two was for Ayanna, and it was far, far more dangerous. She was going back to the Silver Dollar Saloon. She was going to walk back into the lion's den. Her job was to get that ledger from the safe. "It's too dangerous," Thomas argued, his voice raw with fear. "Let me do it. I can handle his men." "They're expecting you to be the threat," she said, her hand resting on her gently swelling belly. "They'll be watching for a gunslinger. They won't be watching for the quiet Indian girl they think they broke. They'll be drunk, distracted. I can slip in and out before they even know I'm there. You taught me how to shoot. I can protect myself." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and knew he couldn't argue. They were in this together, all the way. As darkness fell on Founders' Day, they stood outside their small cabin. The distant sound of music and laughter drifted up from the town. It felt like another world. "If something happens," Thomas began, but she put a finger to his lips. "Nothing will happen," she said. "Tonight, we take back our lives." She kissed him, a long, desperate kiss filled with love and fear, and a terrible, unspoken goodbye. Then they split up, two shadows moving in opposite directions, heading toward a destiny that would either set them free or bury them for good. Thomas had no idea that Ayanna hadn't told him the whole plan. She had a secret of her own, a final, devastating trump card she was prepared to play if everything else went wrong, a secret that would burn Deadwood to the ground. The line shack was exactly where Ayanna said it would be, tucked into a rocky canyon miles from town. Thomas moved like a phantom through the pines, the skills of a lifetime coming back to him. Two guards were posted outside, sloppy and overconfident. They were dead before they knew what hit them, two silent thuds in the darkness. Inside, Jake Torino was laughing. He was sitting across a table from a well-dressed man with a politician's smile. A bag of gold sat between them. "And that's how you run a territory, my friend," Torino was saying, pouring another drink. "A little grease for the wheels of justice." The politician chuckled. "To a profitable partnership, Mr. Torino." "That partnership," Thomas said, stepping out of the shadows with his Colt leveled at Torino's heart, "is hereby dissolved." The room froze. Torino's smile melted off his face, replaced by pure, venomous rage. The politician looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "McKenna," Torino hissed, "I should have killed you when I had the chance." "You should have," Thomas agreed. "Mistake number one." He gestured with his gun toward the politician. "You, on your feet. You're coming with me. You're about to become a star witness for the U.S. Marshals." Torino started to laugh, a low, ugly sound. "You think you've won? You think this is over? You have no idea what's happening in town right now, do you, hero?" A cold dread washed over Thomas. "What did you do?" "Me? I didn't do a thing, but I left a little surprise for your pretty wife. See, I knew you'd come for me eventually. I've been waiting for it. I left 3 of my best men at the saloon. Their only job tonight? Watch the safe. And if anyone tries to get near it, they have orders to burn the whole damn place to the ground, with everyone inside." The blood drained from Thomas's face. It was a trap. The ledger wasn't the prize. It was the bait. Torino never cared about the book. He just wanted to lure Ayanna back to her old prison and burn her alive. She won't be alone, Torino sneered. The whole saloon is packed for the party. Men, women, they'll all go up in smoke, and everyone will blame the crazy Indian girl who went on a rampage. Your wife will die a monster, and you'll have to live with that. Thomas saw red. He was about to pull the trigger to end Torino right there, but the politician suddenly screamed and dove under the table. In that split second of distraction, Torino kicked the table over, sending the lantern crashing to the floor. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the spreading flames of burning oil. A gunshot erupted from Torino's side of the room. Thomas fired back, aiming at the muzzle flash. He heard a grunt of pain, but then the back door of the shack burst open and Torino was gone, disappearing into the night. Thomas didn't have time to chase him. Ayanna, he had to get to Ayanna. He grabbed the terrified politician by the collar, hauled him out of the burning cabin, and threw him onto one of the guards' horses. "You're gonna ride, and you're not gonna stop until you find a U.S. Marshal," Thomas yelled, firing his gun into the air to spook the horse. "You tell them everything, or I will hunt you down myself." Then he was on his own horse, riding like a madman back toward Deadwood, his heart pounding a rhythm of pure terror. The smell of smoke was already on the wind. He was too late. He was too late. As he crested the final hill overlooking the town, he saw it. It wasn't just the silver dollar. The whole damn town was on fire. Flames were leaping from building to building, turning the night sky a hellish orange. Screams echoed through the streets. It wasn't just Torino's trap. It was something far bigger, something apocalyptic. And then he understood. This was Ayanna's trump card. She hadn't just gone for the ledger, she'd gone to war. He saw her then, a silhouette against the flames, standing in the middle of the street. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She had a rifle in one hand and a torch in the other. And she wasn't alone. The women of the town were with her, the wives and mothers and daughters who had been terrorized and abused by Torino's reign. They weren't a mob. They were an army. They had followed Ayanna not just to get a book, but to reclaim their town. They were the ones setting the fires, burning out the rot, destroying the businesses and homes of every man who was on Torino's payroll. They were burning it all to the ground to build something new from the ashes. Thomas rode down into the chaos, his eyes searching for Ayanna. He saw Torino's men, trapped and confused, being pulled down by the righteous fury of the mob. It was a revolution. He finally found her near the smoldering remains of the jailhouse. She had the black ledger clutched in her hand. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched the town around her. "I got it," she said, her voice hoarse. "Ayanna, all this." He gestured to the burning town. "They deserved it," she said, her voice hard as steel. "This place was hell. Sometimes the only way to get rid of hell is to burn it down." But then a shot rang out. Ayanna cried out and stumbled, clutching her side. Blood bloomed on her dress. Jake Torino stood in the doorway of the burning saloon, a smoking pistol in his hand, his face a mask of hate. He was wounded, bleeding from his shoulder where Thomas's bullet had hit him, but he was still standing. "If I'm going to hell," he screamed over the roar of the flames, "I'm taking you both with me." He raised his pistol to fire again, aiming right at Ayanna's heart. Thomas didn't think. He reacted. He shoved Ayanna to the ground, putting himself between her and Torino, and emptied his Colt. Torino staggered back, his chest a bloody mess, a look of disbelief on his face. He fell back into the burning saloon, and the collapsing roof swallowed him in a shower of sparks and flame. It was over. Thomas rushed to Ayanna's side. The bullet had hit her in the side, a bad wound. And as he held her, he saw the first pains of labor contort her face. The baby was coming. Here. Now. In the middle of a burning town, with the whole world gone to hell around them. He picked her up in his arms and carried her away from the fire, searching for any shelter, any safe place, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, praying that he hadn't won the war just to lose everything that mattered. They found shelter in the old church at the edge of town, one of the few buildings the fire hadn't touched. The women, Ayanna's army, followed them. They barred the doors and stood guard while the town they had liberated finished burning. Inside, by the flickering light of the stained glass windows, their child was born, a daughter, small and fragile, but with a powerful cry that cut through the chaos outside. They named her Sarah. Ayanna was weak, feverish from the gunshot wound, but she held her daughter with a fierce, primal love. Looking at them, his wife and his child, in the ruins of their old life, Thomas felt a peace he had never known. They had done it. They had survived. The next few days were a blur. The U.S. Marshals arrived, summoned by the terrified politician. They found a town in ashes, a dead crime boss, and a ledger full of evidence. The story came out, pieced together from the testimony of the women. The story of Torino's corruption, of Judge Morrison and Deputy Collins on his payroll, of the uprising that had cleansed the town. Thomas McKenna was no longer a wanted man. He was a hero. Ayanna was hailed as a revolutionary, a leader who had given the people their town back. They had a future. But the frontier is a cruel, unforgiving place. It gives with one hand and takes with the other. Ayanna's wound became infected. The fever worsened. The doctor from the next town over did his best, but medicine in those days was a game of chance. For a week she fought. She clung to life for him, for their daughter. But it wasn't enough. She died 1 week after the fire, holding his hand. Her last words, they whispered, "Take care of our Blossom." Thomas's world ended. He had faced down death 100 times. He had walked through fire and blood. But this was a pain that brought him to his knees. He had won. He had gotten justice. But what was the point of a perfect world if the only person you wanted to share it with was gone? He was left alone, with a newborn daughter who had her mother's dark eyes. For a while he thought about ending it, about following Ayanna into the darkness. But every time he looked at little Sarah, he saw Ayanna's strength, her courage, her sacrifice. He couldn't let it be for nothing. He had made her a promise. He had promised to build something new. So that's what he did. He didn't leave Deadwood. He stayed. He helped rebuild the town from the ashes, not with greed and gold, but with the principles of fairness and justice that Ayanna had fought for. He raised his daughter on the land they had claimed, telling her stories of the brave, beautiful mother she would never know. He never picked up a gun again. He never married. He poured all the love he had, all the love he and Ayanna had shared, into their daughter. Sarah McKenna grew up to be a force of nature, just like her mother. She had Ayanna's intelligence and Thomas's quiet strength. She became a teacher, then a lawyer, then a judge in the very territory her parents had bled for. She fought for the rights of the native people, for the homesteaders, for the women who were still finding their voice. Thomas lived to be an old man. He died peacefully in his bed, with his daughter and his grandchildren by his side. They buried him on the homestead next to a simple wooden marker that he had carved himself years before. It didn't have a name on it, just a single word, Ayanna, eternal blossom. The story of Thomas and Ayanna McKenna became a legend in that part of the country, a story of love, sacrifice, and revolution. They said a lone bounty hunter and a captive native girl burned down a town to save it, but the truth was simpler and a whole lot more powerful. It was the story of a man who spent his life running from love, who finally found it in the most unlikely of places. It was the story of a woman who refused to be a victim, who became a warrior. It just goes to show you, sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man with a gun. It's a person with something to fight for. If you enjoyed this story and want more that will keep you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. What do you think was Ayanna's bravest moment? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.